For 30 years, I was the quiet foundation of Richard's empire, designing the chemical patents that made him a titan. But when he replaced me with a woman half my age, he assumed my silence meant defeat. As even my own children began to treat me like an embarrassing relic of his past to secure their inheritance, I quietly stepped back and remembered exactly whose name was on the original deeds. If you want to see how a quiet woman dismantles a legacy built on her own sacrifice, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. How much pain can a mother absorb before she decides to quietly reclaim everything she ever gave away? The silver-plated tea tray was a wedding gift from my mother, heavy and slightly tarnished at the handles where my thumbs had pressed into the metal for 3 decades. I polished it in the kitchen, listening to the low, rhythmic hum of our home's water filtration system. It was a familiar sound, one that reminded me of the fluid dynamics laboratories where I had spent my 20s. In those days, Richard had stood beside me, holding the test tubes, his eyes bright with an ambition I had mistaken for devotion. Tonight, that ambition sat in our dining room, represented by the muffled clink of crystal and the smooth, rehearsed cadence of my husband's corporate voice. "The Q4 projections are solid, Nathan," Richard was saying. His voice carried easily through the open double doors of the kitchen. "But the rebranding is where we'll see the real transition. We need to project agility, modernity." "I agree," Nathan replied. Our son's voice was a lighter, eager echo of his father's. "The legacy market is steady, but the younger venture capital firms want to see a fresh face on the masthead. Julianne's team has already drafted the copy for the rollout." I paused, the polishing cloth resting against the silver. Julianne. Her name was never spoken with anger in this house. It was always introduced under the sterile guise of corporate progress. She was the director of brand strategy, hired 8 months ago to revitalize a company built on polymers I had patented before she was born. I set the cloth down, lifted the tray with the fresh pot of Earl Grey, and walked into the dining room. The conversation didn't stop, but its rhythm faltered, like a record skipping over a familiar scratch. Richard didn't look up immediately. He was adjusting the cuff of his linen shirt, his silver hair catching the amber light of the chandelier. Nathan glanced at me, a brief flicker of discomfort crossing his face, before he smoothed his expression into a polite, distant smile. "Thanks, Mom," Nathan said, reaching out to clear a space among the spreadsheets scattered across the mahogany table. "You didn't have to do that. We could have asked the housekeeper." "Elsie has the evening off, Nathan," I said softly, setting the tray down. My voice was low, devoid of the sharp edges they expected me to show. "And I don't mind." "Meredith, we're in the middle of reviewing the restructuring drafts," Richard said, his tone perfectly measured, carrying the gentle patronization he reserved for public spaces. He didn't look at me. His eyes were already scanning the next page of Nathan's report. "We'll take the tea in the study later if we need it." It was a quiet dismissal, one of 1,000 tiny cuts that had characterized the last year. I didn't leave. Instead, I stood at the head of the table, my hand resting on the back of the empty chair that had once been mine, before Richard moved the corporate meetings from the office to our home. Chloe sat at the far end of the table, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass. She looked at me, then at her father, her eyes filled with a fragile, nervous guilt. She was 24, living in a brownstone in the city that Richard paid for, presenting exhibitions of artists Richard sponsored. "Mom," Chloe murmured, her voice thin. "Did you see the flowers I sent for the foyer? The orchids?" "They're beautiful, Chloe, thank you," I said. "Julianne helped me pick them," Chloe added quickly, almost defensively, as if seeking validation that the choice had been correct. "She knows a lot about minimalist design. She said the foyer looked a bit dated." The word hung in the air, heavy and clinical. Dated. like the floral wallpaper I had chosen when we bought this house, like the woman who had spent 30 years maintaining it. Nathan cleared his throat, shifting his papers. Dad, regarding the patent renewals for the proprietary resin, we need to file the corporate assignment by the end of the month. The legal team said the original paperwork is still under the old partnership structure. Richard finally looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. It's a formality. The partnership was dissolved when we went public in 12. I'll sign the transfer documents tomorrow. Actually, Nathan murmured, his eyes scanning the document. The original filing was listed under a personal holding. It wasn't swept into the 12 transition. Legal says we need the original inventor's signature to finalize the corporate reassignment. Otherwise, the licensing rights revert to the individual. Richard waved his hand dismissively. I'll handle it, it's just paperwork. He did not look at me. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had simply convinced himself over the years that the original patent for the resin, the very chemical compound that generated 80% of Vance Polymer Solutions' revenue, had not been written by him. I looked at the blue fountain pen resting on his leather folder. It was the same pen I had used in 1994, in the damp basement of our first apartment, to sign the initial patent drafts while our newborn son slept in a laundry basket beside the desk. Richard had been the one to file them at the courthouse because I had been too exhausted to stand. He had signed his name as the administrator, but the inventor column had only one name. I should get back to the kitchen, I said quietly, stepping away from the table. Thanks, Mom, Nathan said, already looking back down at his tablet. As I walked back into the hallway, I heard Richard's low voice resume. We need to expedite this, Nathan. If we merge with the European group in the spring, I want all legacy assets fully integrated under the new brand. Julianne thinks it's cleaner that way. I stood in the dim light of the hallway, my back against the cold plaster wall. The water filtration system hummed in the basement, a steady, unyielding vibration. They had already built a world where I did not exist, using the bricks I had baked with my own hands. But as I looked down at my worn palm, still smelling faintly of silver polish, I realized something Richard had overlooked in his haste to build his new life. He had never asked me where I kept the original filing receipts. Richard left before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. I stood at the kitchen window, watching the red taillights of his sedan fade down the long, winding driveway. The house was cold in the early mornings, a damp chill rising from the lake that our heated floors never quite seemed to reach. On the kitchen island sat his empty coffee mug, a smear of dark foam drying against the porcelain, and a single crumpled napkin. I picked up the mug. It was still warm. I set it in the sink, then took a sponge and began to wipe down the quartz countertop, moving in the slow, circular patterns I had used for decades. By 8, the house was entirely silent. I walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the attic door was tucked behind a linen closet. The air up here smelled of cedar and old paper. This was where the remnants of our early years lived. The cardboard boxes labeled Vance Labs, 91 to 95, filled with handwritten formulas, early polymer samples in glass vials, and the heavy, black-bound notebooks of my graduate research. I stopped at the entrance of the storage bay. One of the boxes labeled Product Development, Catalyst B, was sitting out of alignment on the metal shelving. The packing tape on top had been sliced open with a box cutter, the flaps pulled back and carelessly tucked inside. I walked over and looked inside. My old lab journals had been shifted. The yellowed index cards where I had meticulously recorded the molecular weights of our first successful compounds were out of order. Someone had gone through them with hurried, impatient fingers. I touched the cardboard edge of the box. Meredith? I turned. Richard had told me he was going straight to the office, but he must have forgotten his briefcase. He stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, his coat open, looking up at me with a slight, defensive frown. "What are you doing up here?" he asked, his voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. "Just cleaning, Richard," I said, my voice even. "Looking through some of the old research." He took 2 steps up the stairs, his leather-soled shoes loud against the wood. "I told Nathan to have his assistant look through those boxes yesterday. We needed to find the original 1994 filing receipts for the polymer resin. The legal team is doing a routine sweep." "You didn't ask me," I said. Richard paused. He adjusted his watch, a gold piece I had bought him for his 50th birthday with money we had supposedly saved together. "You were at the grocery store, Meredith. I didn't want to bother you with corporate administrative details. It's just standard filing." "Your assistant didn't find them," I noted, looking down at the open box. "No," Richard said, a small flicker of irritation crossing his brow before he smoothed it away with a sigh. "The filing system from those early years is a mess. I don't know why we didn't digitize everything back in 2012. If you happen to know which box they're in, let Nathan know. It's keeping the legal department back." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and Julianne wanted to know if we could host the charity committee here next Thursday. She thinks the lakeside view is perfect for the donors. You don't mind, do you? You won't have to do much. She's hiring a caterer." "Of course," I said. "I don't mind." "Good. I'll let her know." He descended the stairs, his footsteps fading as he walked out the front door. At noon, I met Chloe at a small, quiet cafe, 3 blocks from her gallery. She was already seated when I arrived, her fingers flying across her phone screen. When she saw me, she quickly turned the phone face down and offered a bright, performative smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, you look nice," she said, leaning forward to kiss my cheek. She smelled of expensive jasmine perfume, a scent I knew Julianne also wore. "I'm so glad we could do this. It's been weeks." "It has," I said, setting my handbag on the empty chair beside me. "How is the new exhibition coming along?" "Oh, it's amazing," she said, her chest rising with a sudden, eager energy. "The PR firm Julianne recommended has been incredible. We've already got RSVPs from 3 major collectors. Dad is matching whatever we raise at the silent auction." I watched her face as she spoke. She was beautiful, inheriting Richard's sharp jawline and my dark, quiet eyes. But there was a restlessness in her, a constant need to ensure the ground beneath her feet remained solid. "Chloe," I said softly, interrupting her flow of gallery logistics, "are you happy?" She blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Of course I am, Mom. Why wouldn't I be?" "I just wanted to make sure," I said, with everything changing. Chloe looked down at her water glass, her gold bracelets clinking against the marble table. "If you mean Dad and Julianne, Mom, you have to understand. It's just how things are now. You and Dad haven't really been close in such a long time. You always preferred staying home, and he had to travel for the company." "Is that what he told you?" I asked. "No," she said, her voice rising slightly, a defensive edge creeping in. "It's just obvious. And Julianne is actually really sweet, Mom. She's helped me so much with the gallery. She's not trying to replace you. She just wants everyone to be happy." She wants everyone to be quiet, I thought. She wants me to be invisible so she can enjoy the warmth of the fire I built. "I see," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "I'm glad she's helping your gallery, Chloe." Chloe looked relieved, her posture relaxing. She reached across the table and touched my hand. "Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd understand. You've always been the strong one. You don't need all the drama." When I returned home, I went straight to the basement. Beyond the finished game room and the wine cellar, lay a small, unfinished utility room where the water softener and the electrical panels lived. In the farthest corner, behind an old workbench Richard had bought and never used, sat a heavy, green metal lockbox. It didn't look like much. It looked like an old toolbox. I pulled it out into the dim light of the single overhead bulb. The key was on my ring, tucked behind the key to our safety deposit box. I inserted it, turned the lock, and lifted the lid. Inside were no corporate ledgers or shiny plaques. There were only 3 yellowed folders. I opened the first one. It contained the original patent application for the Vance Polymer Formula 404, dated September 14, 1994. My eyes scanned the elegant, faded blue ink of my own handwriting. At the bottom of the page was the signature of the inventor, Meredith A. Vance. And beneath it, the clause we had drafted with a small-town lawyer who had since retired. Section 4, Reversion. The clause stated that the licensing rights were granted to Vance Labs for a period of 20 years, renewable for another 10, after which the corporate entity was required to file a signed, bilateral agreement with the primary inventor to extend the transfer. If no such agreement was filed within 30 days of the expiration date, the entire licensing authority reverted solely to the inventor. The 30-day window had opened yesterday. Richard didn't need a routine signature to streamline the taxes. He needed my signature because in exactly 20 days, the patent that allowed his company to manufacture its primary product would legally expire, and all manufacturing rights would revert entirely to me. And he had no idea I was the only one who held the key to the lockbox. Julianne arrived 45 minutes before the charity committee was scheduled to begin. She did not knock. She had her own key. I heard the soft click of the front door, followed by the light, rhythmic tap of her heels on the hardwood foyer. She was wearing a tailored cream blazer and carried a clipboard, her dark hair pulled back into a flawless, corporate knot. Behind her, 2 catering assistants carried large silver warming trays. "Meredith, good morning," Julianne said, her voice bright and perfectly pitched. She offered a warm, professional smile that stopped precisely at her eyes. "I hope we're not disrupting you. I wanted to get the caterers set up before the ladies arrive." "You're not disrupting me, Julianne," I said, standing near the kitchen island. I had spent the morning baking a lemon tart, a recipe my grandmother had taught me, the scent of sweet citrus still lingering in the air. Julianne stepped into the dining room, her eyes scanning the space with clinical efficiency. She stopped at the long mahogany table, where I had placed my mother's hand-woven linen runner. "Oh," Julianne murmured, her brow lifting slightly as she tapped her chin with her pen. "This runner is lovely, Meredith. Very rustic. But for the donor committee, we're aiming for a more modern, streamlined aesthetic. We want to highlight the contemporary art pieces Richard just acquired." She turned to one of the caterers. "Let's swap this out for the white silk linens we brought, please. And let's move these dried flowers. We need something more architectural. White lilies, perhaps?" The caterer immediately began to fold my mother's runner, placing it carelessly on a nearby chair. I watched the fabric fold. It was the runner I had washed by hand after every family Thanksgiving, the one Nathan had spilled cranberry sauce on when he was 6. Now, it was simply rustic, an obstacle to a more streamlined aesthetic. "I'll put that away," I said quietly, stepping forward to pick up the folded linen. "Thank you so much," Julianne said, already looking down at her clipboard. "You're always so accommodating, Meredith. Richard always says you're the rock of this household. So steady." It was a compliment wrapped in a burial shroud. She was thanking me for being still while they rearranged the room around me. By 2 o'clock, the dining room was filled with 12 of the city's most prominent women. Among them were Sarah and Evelyn, women I had known since our children were in preschool. women who had sat at this very table when Richard and I were still struggling to pay our mortgage. Now they sat in the white silk chairs Julianne had brought, sipping champagne. I stood near the sideboard, pouring tea from the silver tray. I had chosen to wear a simple gray knit dress, unobtrusive, almost matching the shadow of the heavy drapes. "The new gallery space is just magnificent, Julianne," Sarah was saying, her voice dripping with the quiet social sycophancy that keeps our circle moving. "And Richard's support has been absolutely vital." "Richard has a wonderful eye for potential," Julianne replied, her smile radiant as she stood at the head of the table. "We really want Vance Polymer to be synonymous with cultural progress. It's not just about chemical manufacturing anymore. It's about legacy." "And you've done such a marvelous job organizing this, dear," Evelyn added, glancing briefly at me before looking back to Julianne. There was a flicker of pity in Evelyn's eyes, a small, uncomfortable twitch, but she quickly drowned it in another sip of champagne. They had made their peace with the new structure. Richard was the donor, Julianne was the gateway to the donor. I was just the wife who stayed behind. Nathan walked into the room then, dressed in his VP suit, holding a folder. He bypassed me entirely, walking straight to Julianne to whisper something in her ear. She nodded, her hand resting familiarly on his forearm for a brief second. "Ladies," Nathan announced, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a young executive. "My father is just finishing a call, but he wanted me to thank you all for being here. We're incredibly proud of the work Julianne has done with this committee." A light round of applause rippled through the room. I stood by the sideboard, the heavy silver teapot hot in my hand, completely invisible in the bright, modern room they had built inside my house. When the guests finally left at 5, the house felt hollowed out, smelling of expensive perfume and discarded catered appetizers. Richard called me into the study. The study was his domain, lined with leather-bound books he had never read and framed articles about the growth of Vance Polymer. Nathan was sitting in one of the leather armchairs, his laptop open. Julianne stood near the window, quietly checking her phone. "Meredith, sit down for a moment," Richard said, his tone gentle, the same tone he used when he was about to announce budget cuts to a manufacturing plant. I sat in the chair opposite him. He slid a neat, blue folder across the mahogany desk. Beside it, he placed his gold-plated fountain pen. "What is this?" I asked, looking at the document. "It's just some administrative cleanup," Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "As Nathan mentioned last night, we're preparing the historical assets for the European merger. This is a standard waiver, just a formal sign-off stating that any early research and development conducted under the Vance Labs name is fully owned by the corporate entity." "It's totally routine, Mom," Nathan chimed in, not looking up from his screen. "Just clearing up some old intellectual property ambiguity so the auditors don't flag it." I looked down at the document. The text was dense, written in the small, suffocating font of corporate lawyers. But my eyes caught the phrase, "hereby relinquishes all individual, historical, and residual rights, patents, and licensing claims." If I sign this, the 1994 patent and the reversion clause that would activate in 20 days would vanish. It would be swept into their corporate machine, leaving me with nothing but the alimony Richard's lawyers would eventually deem fair. "I'd like to read it over first, Richard," I said softly. The room went completely still. The low hum of the water filtration system seemed to grow louder in the silence. Nathan's fingers stopped moving over his keyboard. Julianne slowly lowered her phone, her eyes narrowing just a fraction as she looked at me from the window. Richard's smile didn't disappear, but it hardened, the warmth evaporating from his eyes. "Meredith," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a subtle, warning weight. It's standard corporate boilerplate. You wouldn't really understand the legal jargon. It's just to satisfy the auditors so we can close the deal. I still have my degree, Richard, I said, my voice remaining perfectly calm, perfectly polite. I think I can manage the jargon. I'll take it to my room and look it over tonight. I picked up the folder and stood. Richard didn't move, but his hand tightened slightly on the arm of his chair. "Don't take too long," he said, his voice cold. "We need those filings executed by Friday." I walked out of the room, holding the blue folder against my chest, the silence of the house closing in behind me. I slept in the guest room at the end of the hall. It was smaller than the master suite, its windows facing the dark, silent woods behind the property rather than the lake. I had moved my clothes here months ago, a gradual migration that Richard had neither questioned nor acknowledged. Our separation had been like the shifting of tectonic plates, slow, silent, and irreversible. Under the dim light of the bedside lamp, I read the waiver again. The legal language was beautiful in its cruelty. It didn't just transfer the rights, it sought to rewrite history. It classified my 30 years of research as incidental domestic contributions. It reduced the countless nights I had spent inhaling chemical vapors in our makeshift laboratory to administrative assistance. I touched the pale, thin scar on my left wrist. It was a chemical burn from the winter of 1993, when a glass beaker of hot acidic polymer had cracked under a faulty heating element. Richard had been asleep upstairs, exhausted from a day of failed pitch meetings. I had bandaged the wound myself, using ice from the freezer and sterile gauze, and continued the crystallization process. If I had stopped, the batch would have ruined, and we wouldn't have had a prototype to show the investors the following Monday. Now, that burn was an incidental domestic contribution. Downstairs, I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing. Richard was leaving again, likely returning to the city apartment he kept near the corporate offices, the one he claimed was for late-night strategy sessions. He didn't come upstairs to check on me. He didn't ask if I had signed the paper. He was simply freezing me out, waiting for the cold to do its work. The next morning, the kitchen was silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Nathan arrived at 7:30, his tie slightly crooked, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 cups of artisanal coffee. He set them on the kitchen island and looked at me, his eyes guarded. "Where's Dad?" he asked. "He left last night, Nathan," I said, pouring hot water into my tea mug. Nathan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mom, we're on a very tight timeline here. The European delegation is flying in on the 25th. If we don't have the IP clearances finalized by the end of this week, the preliminary audit will show a compliance gap. It looks bad. It makes us look disorganized." "I am still reading the document, Nathan," I said softly, taking a seat at the island. Nathan walked over, leaning his hands on the quartz countertop. He looked older than 28 in that moment, his face tight with the pressure of a world he was desperately trying to control. "Mom, please, you're being difficult for no reason. You've never cared about the corporate structure before. You've always let Dad handle the business side. Why now?" "Because the business side is asking me to sign a paper that says I did nothing, Nathan," I said. My voice didn't rise. It remained as quiet as the room. "Do you know what the 1994 patent actually is?" Nathan blinked, his jaw tightening. "It's the foundational resin formula." "Of course I know." "Do you know who formulated it?" "You and Dad," he said, though there was a slight, hesitant pause before the words left his mouth. "You worked on it together." "I formulated it, Nathan. Your father was in Chicago trying to secure a line of credit that we didn't get. I spent 72 hours in the basement of our apartment, running the chromatography columns by hand because we couldn't afford an automated pump. When your father came back, the formula was on the table. Nathan looked down at his coffee cup. He didn't deny it, but he didn't acknowledge it either. To acknowledge it would be to complicate the narrative that sustained his career. "That was 30 years ago, Mom," he said quietly. "The company is different now. We have 300 employees. We have global distribution. It's not just about who was in the basement anymore." "I know," I said. "And yet, they still need my signature." At 3 o'clock, Chloe's car pulled into the driveway. She didn't run up the steps as she usually did. She walked slowly, holding a small cardboard box of pastries she had bought from the bakery near her gallery. When she entered the kitchen, she set the box down and looked at me with a look of profound theatrical exhaustion. "Mom," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "Dad is completely beside himself. He called me twice this morning." "Is he?" I asked, setting a plate on the table for her. "Yes, he says the merger is in jeopardy because you're refusing to cooperate with the legal team." She sat down, ignoring the plate, her face drawn into a tight pout. "Mom, do you know what this does to my gallery? Dad's sponsorship budget for the upcoming season is tied to the merger's liquidity. If the European deal gets delayed, the gallery's funding is the first thing he's going to cut. I've already committed to the artists." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a raw, selfish desperation that she had dressed up as familial concern. "Chloe," I said, "are you asking me to sign away my life's work so your gallery can have a spring exhibition?" "It's not your life's work, Mom," she snapped, her voice rising, losing its polished gallery cadence. "You're retired. You haven't been in a lab in 20 years. You just stay here and garden. What do you even need a patent for? You're not going to build a company. You're just holding on to it to punish Dad." She looked at me with a hard, unforgiving glare. To her, I was an obstacle. I was a stubborn old woman who was ruining her father's success and, by extension, her own comfort. "You don't even use the money, Mom," she added, her voice dropping into a manipulative whine. "Dad takes care of everything. Why can't you just let him have this?" I looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried, the girl whose childhood fevers I had watched over while Richard was away on business trips. She didn't see a biochemist. She didn't see a woman who had sacrificed her own career to build the wealth that bought her designer clothes. She saw a utility, and that utility was currently failing to perform. "I will think about it, Chloe," I said quietly, standing up to put the pastries in the refrigerator. "Don't think too long," she muttered, picking up her car keys, "because if my show gets canceled, I'm never going to forgive you." She walked out, slamming the front door behind her. I stood in the kitchen, the silence rushing back to fill the space she had vacated. I looked at the calendar on the wall. The 25th of the month was marked with a red circle, European delegation arrival, and the patent's reversion date was the 24th. Richard's entire merger was built on a foundation of sand, and he had no idea the tide was already coming in. On Wednesday morning, the telephone rang. "Mrs. Vance?" The voice was polite, professionally cheerful, and instantly recognizable. It was Arthur, the events coordinator at the Lakeside Country Club, where our family had held a membership for 24 years. "Yes, Arthur, good morning," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance. I'm just finalizing the seating arrangements for the pre-merger gala this Friday evening. We have the head table set for 12, and I wanted to confirm your dietary preferences. I know you usually prefer the sea bass, but Ms. Mercer's office requested a vegan menu for the entire head table. I wanted to make sure you were comfortable with that before we printed the cards." The silence that followed was small, but it filled the kitchen like a physical weight. Arthur, sensing the hesitation, cleared his throat softly. "Arthur," I said, my voice steady and quiet. "Am I listed on the seating chart?" A long, agonizing pause stretched over the line. I could hear the rustle of paper on his end, the sudden nervous stiffness in his breath. "Oh, let me check the draft Ms. Mercer's assistant sent over. I assumed, well, Mr. Vance and Ms. Mercer are at the center, and then Nathan and Chloe." Oh dear. "Mrs. Vance, I seem to have made an assumption. I am so sorry." "It's quite all right, Arthur," I said, keeping my tone perfectly polite to spare him the embarrassment. "Please do not worry. I won't be attending the gala. You may proceed with Ms. Mercer's menu." "Thank you, Mrs. Vance. You are always so gracious. My apologies again." I hung up the receiver. My hands were cold. I walked over to the dining room table and opened my tablet, navigating to the local business journal's social page. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There was a photograph from the previous evening's charity auction. Richard stood in the center, looking tanned and vital in his bespoke tuxedo. Julianne stood at his side, her hand resting on his arm, wearing an emerald silk gown that whispered of quiet wealth. Flanking them were Nathan and Chloe. They were all smiling. They looked like a complete, happy family. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Vance Polymer CEO Richard Vance with Director of Brand Strategy Julianne Mercer and family, celebrating the upcoming European partnership." And family. My children had not mentioned the auction to me. They had not mentioned the gala. They had simply stepped into the frame, filling the empty space where I used to stand, posing for the cameras as if the woman who had raised them had never existed. It was a social erasure, clean and bloodless. Richard was not going to divorce me with a loud public battle. He was simply going to let me fade into the background until everyone, including my own children, forgot I was ever there. An hour later, I was in my car, driving away from the lake. I did not go to the corporate offices in the financial district. Instead, I drove to the older industrial sector of the city, where the brick warehouses had been converted into modest offices. I parked outside a 3-story building with a fading brass plaque near the door. Arthur Pendleton, attorney at law. Arthur was 72, a man with thick white eyebrows and a meticulous old-school manner. He had handled our family's very first patent filings in the early 90s, back when Richard's business was just a desk in our living room. Unlike the high-priced corporate firm that now managed Vance Polymer, Arthur owed no loyalty to Richard. He was a man of the law, stubborn and precise. He greeted me in his office, which smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco. He poured me a cup of black coffee in a chipped ceramic mug and sat behind his heavy oak desk, adjusting his spectacles as he opened the folder I had brought. "Meredith," he said, his voice deep and raspy. "It's been a long time." "It has, Arthur," I said. "I need you to look at this." I handed him the original 1994 patent document and the waiver Richard had asked me to sign. Arthur read them in silence, his eyes moving slowly behind his lenses. Occasionally, he made a small, grunting sound in his throat. "The 1994 polymer resin," Arthur murmured, looking up. "The foundation of the entire Vance catalog. Without this compound, they're just a distribution company. They can't manufacture a single sheet of the high-tensile backing." "Yes," I said. "Richard needs me to sign this waiver before Friday so he can finalize the merger." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his thick eyebrows knitting together. "Meredith, you need to know something. Richard's corporate attorneys filed a provisional emergency extension with the patent office 3 days ago." I felt a cold prickle of dread in my chest. How? The patent requires my signature for renewal. Arthur pulled a document from a stack on his desk. They filed under an emergency executive declaration. It's a loophole used when a primary inventor is physically or mentally incapacitated during a critical corporate transition. The filing claims that you are currently unable to execute your duties due to cognitive decline, and that Richard, as CEO and spouse, is executing the extension under temporary power of attorney to protect the corporate interest. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Cognitive decline. Richard wasn't just waiting for me to sign. He had already drafted the narrative to bypass me entirely. He was telling the patent office, and soon the board, that his quiet, stay-at-home wife was losing her mind, turning her into a tragic excuse for his legal maneuvering. "If this extension is granted," Arthur said gravely, "it bypasses the reversion clause. It merges the patent permanently into the corporate portfolio. The window to contest this is incredibly small, Meredith. Once the merger is signed on the 25th, the European group's legal shield will make it nearly impossible to overturn." "When does the contest window close?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "The 24th, Arthur said. The day the patent is set to revert to you. If we file a formal declaration of capacity and contest the extension before then, we halt the entire merger process. The European partners will freeze the deal the second they see an ownership dispute." He looked at me, his eyes gentle but searching. "But you must understand, Meredith. If we file this, it will not be quiet. Richard will know. Your children will know. The world they've built will begin to crack. Are you ready for that?" I looked out the window at the gray city skyline. I thought of the empty seat at the head table, the folded linen runner, and the smiling faces of my children in the business journal. "They have already decided I am dead, Arthur," I said quietly. "I am just choosing the date of my own resurrection." When I returned home, Richard was in the living room. It was the first time in weeks he had been home during the middle of the day. He was standing by the French doors that opened to the terrace, a cup of coffee in his hand. When he heard my footsteps, he turned. There was no irritation on his face. Instead, his features softened into a look of quiet, exaggerated tenderness. An expression so foreign on his face that it sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my chest. "Meredith," he said, setting his coffee down and walking toward me. "Where have you been, honey? We were worried. I called your phone twice." "I had my ringer off, Richard," I said, keeping my hands steady as I placed my car keys on the console table. "I went for a drive." He came closer, reaching out to gently touch my shoulder. His touch was light, tentative, the way one might touch a fragile, erratic child. "You shouldn't be driving into the city alone, Meredith. The traffic has been terrible lately and, well, Nathan said you seemed a bit confused during dinner the other night. We just want you to be safe." I looked into my husband's eyes. They were clear, blue, and utterly devoid of truth. He was already rehearsing. He was practicing the role of the devoted, long-suffering husband who was watching his wife slowly slip away into the fog of dementia. "I am not confused, Richard," I said softly, stepping back so his hand fell away from my shoulder. "Of course you aren't," he said, his voice dropping into a soothing, patronizing register. "But you've been under a lot of stress. This house is so large and you spend so much time alone here. Nathan and I were talking, and we think it might be time to look into some domestic assistance, someone to help you manage the day-to-day, just to keep things organized." He was laying the groundwork. First, a housekeeper who would double as a companion, then a driver, then a quiet legal confinement behind the walls of this estate while he and Julianne ran the company on the proceeds of my polymers. "I don't need help managing, Richard," I said. He smiled, a sad, indulgent little smile. "Let's not make any decisions today. Why don't you go upstairs and rest? The gala is tonight, and I want you to have a quiet evening while we're out." By 5 o'clock, the house was alive with the nervous, electric energy of preparation. Nathan had arrived to help his father pack the garment bags. Chloe was in the guest bathroom, steam pressing her gown, her voice drifting down the hallway as she complained about a loose thread on her hem. I sat in the small armchair in the kitchen, holding a cup of cold tea. None of them spoke to me directly, but they spoke about me in low, hurried whispers just outside the door. "Is she still refusing to sign?" I heard Chloe whisper to Nathan near the pantry. She's not herself, Chloe," Nathan replied, his voice hushed, tinged with a defensive frustration. "Dad said she's been having these episodes, forgetting things. Holding on to the paperwork is just her way of trying to feel in control. We just have to let Dad handle it." "It's so selfish," Chloe muttered. "She's going to ruin everything because she's bitter." I closed my eyes. Bitter. Not herself. It was so much easier for them to believe I was losing my mind than to admit they were actively helping their father rob me. If I was sick, then they weren't betraying their mother. They were simply managing a family crisis. It was a beautiful piece of psychological self-preservation. Richard descended the stairs, looking immaculate in his black tuxedo. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, the ones I had polished for him, and smiled at Nathan. "We should head out," Richard said. "Julianne wants us there 30 minutes before the press arrives to do a quick walkthrough of the reception hall." "Ready when you are, Dad," Nathan said, grabbing his coat. Chloe came down next, her emerald silk gown rustling against the stairs. She looked beautiful, a perfect product of the wealth this family had accumulated. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at me, her expression a mix of guilt and cold irritation. "We're leaving, Mom," she said, her voice stiff. "There's some chicken salad in the fridge for you. Please make sure you lock the doors tonight." "Have a wonderful time, Chloe," I said. My voice was calm, empty of the anger she was prepared to fight. Richard walked over, leaning down to press a performative kiss to my forehead. He smelled of expensive cologne and cedar. "Rest well, Meredith. We'll be late." I sat in the chair as the front door closed, followed by the sound of 3 car doors shutting in unison. The engines started, their low rumbles fading down the driveway until the silence of the woods rushed back to swallow the house. I stood up and walked to the kitchen island. Sitting beside my cold tea mug was a small white card I hadn't noticed earlier. I picked it up. It was an appointment reminder from the Lakeside Neurological Group. My name was typed neatly at the top. The appointment was scheduled for next Monday, October 20th at 10 a.m. with a Dr. Lawrence Sterling. On the back of the card, Richard had written in his elegant, sweeping script, "Meredith, I scheduled this for you. Dr. Sterling is the best in the state. Let's get some answers so we can get you some help. I'll take you myself." I stared at the ink. Today was Friday the 17th. The appointment was on Monday the 20th. If I walked into that clinic, Richard's lawyers would use the very act of the consultation and whatever preliminary cognitive screening they had undoubtedly prepaid for to bolster their filing of incapacity. He didn't want answers. He wanted a medical file with my name on it. He was going to lock the trap on Monday morning. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 6:30. I had exactly 64 hours before Richard came to take me to that appointment. 64 hours before my own family legally declared me a ghost. I picked up my phone and dialed Arthur Pendleton's private number. Arthur Pendleton answered on the third ring. The background of his call was quiet, filled only with the faint, warm crackle of a classical record playing in his study. "Arthur?" I said, my voice steady but thin. "Richard has scheduled an appointment for me at the Lakeside Neurological Group for Monday morning. He's trying to build a clinical trail." A heavy, deliberate silence came over the line. I could hear Arthur shifting in his leather chair, the rustle of a notepad. "The Lakeside Group," Arthur said, his tone dropping into the grave, diagnostic register of a seasoned attorney. "The senior partner there is a close associate of the firm that handles Vance Polymer's corporate defense. It's a setup, Meredith. If you attend, they will likely find preliminary indicators of cognitive vulnerability. If you refuse to go, they will document your refusal as a symptom of clinical paranoia and self-neglect. It is a classic pincer move." "What do we do?" I asked, looking out the kitchen window into the dark, silent woods. "We strike first," Arthur said. "But we have to do it before Monday. We need an independent, comprehensive, forensic psychiatric evaluation from a neutral, certified professional, someone whose credentials the court cannot dispute. I am going to call Dr. Miriam Ross. She was the chief of forensic psychiatry for the state hospital system before she went into private consulting. She owes me a professional courtesy from a corporate fraud case we handled 10 years ago." "Will she see me over the weekend?" "She will see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, Arthur said. "Get some sleep, Meredith. Tomorrow, you are going to prove you are the sharpest mind in that family." On Saturday morning, the lake was covered in a thick gray mist. I left the house at 7:30. Richard's car was still absent from the driveway. He had likely stayed at the city penthouse after the gala. The house was dead, cold, and empty as I pulled away, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. Dr. Ross's office was located in a quiet residential neighborhood on the edge of the city, housed in a modest brick colonial that looked more like a home than a clinic. Dr. Ross herself was a woman of 65 with short, steel-gray hair and eyes that were incredibly sharp behind her thin, wire-rimmed glasses. She didn't wear a white coat. She wore a wool cardigan and offered me a cup of hot tea in a heavy ceramic mug. "Meredith," she said, her voice calm and entirely free of the performative sweetness Richard had used. "Arthur has explained the situation to me. I'm going to administer a full battery of cognitive and psychological diagnostics. Some of this will feel tedious, but we need an airtight record." "I understand," I said. For the next 4 hours, I sat at her oak table. We went through memory retention, spatial coordination, and logical sequence testing. But Dr. Ross did not just use standard questionnaires. She asked me about my background. "Tell me about your research, Meredith," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Arthur tells me you are a biochemist." I looked down at my hands. I was. I developed the high-tensile polymer resin that Vance Polymer manufactures. "Can you explain the synthesis process to me?" she asked. I closed my eyes for a second. The formulas, the molecular chains, the precise thermal thresholds, they were carved into my mind, as clear as the day I had first written them down. "It's a multi-stage copolymerization," I said, my voice rising slightly, finding a cadence of confidence I hadn't used in 30 years. "We initiate with high-density ethylene and methyl acrylate under 200 atmospheres of pressure. The critical step is the catalyst, a proprietary titanium-aluminum complex. If the temperature exceeds 42 degrees Celsius during the tertiary addition, the polymer chains degrade, resulting in a brittle material. I spent 3 years adjusting the cooling jacket flow to maintain that specific thermal window." I spoke for 20 minutes, detail by detail, reciting the precise chemical weights and reactions without a single hesitation. Dr. Ross watched me, her pen resting on her notepad. There was no pity in her eyes. There was only a profound, intellectual respect. Psychological insight. It is terrifying how easily a woman's quietness is recharacterized as confusion when her intelligence no longer serves the comfort of the men around her. For decades, my silence had been convenient for them. The moment I chose to use my voice, they labeled it a disease. At 1 o'clock, Dr. Ross stood up and walked to her printer. She pulled 3 pages from the tray, signed them with a heavy black pen, and slid them into a manila envelope. "Your cognitive processing is in the 98th percentile for your demographic," she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "Your long-term and short-term memory retention are exceptional. I have certified that there is absolutely no evidence of cognitive decline, impairment, or vulnerability." She handed the envelope to Arthur, who had been waiting in the reception room. "This is an airtight shield, Meredith," Arthur said, holding the envelope against his chest. "When Richard's lawyers present their emergency extension on Monday, we will file this affidavit alongside a formal contest of the power of attorney. It will freeze their corporate transition instantly." But as Arthur spoke, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the screen. The color slowly drained from his face. "Arthur?" I asked, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. "What is it?" Arthur looked up, his brow furrowed with a sudden, grave concern. "Meredith, my contact in the compliance department of your primary bank just messaged me. Richard's attorneys have just filed an administrative freeze on all your joint accounts, citing suspicious transactions by a co-signer under potential cognitive vulnerability." I stared at him. "He froze the accounts?" "Every single one of them," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a tense whisper. "Your credit cards, your household account, the funds we were going to use to pay for my legal representation. He is cutting off your oxygen, Meredith. He wants to ensure you don't have the financial capacity to hire a lawyer to fight him on Monday morning." I stood in the quiet office, the gray Saturday light spilling through the window. Richard was moving faster than we had anticipated. He wasn't just trying to declare me incompetent, he was starving me out. I had exactly 48 hours, and I was about to be completely broke. I stopped at the pharmacy on the way back from Dr. Ross's office. It was a small independent chemist in town where I had filled our family's prescriptions for 20 years. The air inside smelled of peppermint and rubbing alcohol. Behind the counter was Clara, a woman whose children had gone to the same elementary school as Nathan and Chloe. "Just the thyroid medication today, Meredith?" she asked, her eyes warm as she retrieved the small amber bottle from the shelf. "Yes, Clara, thank you," I said, reaching into my handbag for my wallet. I slid my primary Visa card across the counter. Clara swiped it. The machine gave a brief, high-pitched beep. She frowned, swiped it again, and then looked up at me with a soft, embarrassed smile. "It's saying card restricted, Meredith. Maybe the chip is dirty?" I felt a cold sensation in the pit of my stomach, though my face remained perfectly calm. "Let's try this one," I said, handing her the MasterCard, the one linked to our household account. She ran it. The same sharp, clinical beep echoed in the quiet shop. Clara's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep discomfort. She looked down at her screen, then back at me, her voice dropping into a hushed, apologetic whisper. "It's declined too, dear. Do you have another way to pay? It's $42. I looked at the amber bottle on the counter. It was my daily thyroid hormone. Without it, within 48 hours, the fatigue would begin to claw at my limbs, slowing my thoughts, making my joints ache. Richard knew this. He had sat beside me through every medical appointment. He knew exactly how much I relied on that little bottle. "I'm sorry, Clara," I said, my voice soft and entirely devoid of panic. "I seem to have left my checkbook at home. I'll have to come back for it later." "Of course, Meredith. I'll keep it under the counter for you," Clara said, her eyes filled with a heavy, searching pity. She knew who Richard was. She knew about the merger. She had undoubtedly seen the photos in the business journal. And now, she was watching the billionaire's wife struggle to pay for a $42 prescription. When I pulled into the driveway, Richard's car was parked near the garage. He was in the kitchen when I walked in, standing by the island, reviewing a stack of corporate correspondence. Nathan was beside him, holding an iPad, his face tight with the silent, vibrating tension that had infected this house like mold. I set my handbag on the console table and walked into the room. Richard looked up. The mask of performative concern was back in place, his eyes wide and soft. "Meredith, Clara from the pharmacy just called the office. She said your cards were declined." He stepped toward me, his hands raised in a gesture of gentle, defensive explanation. "Honey, I'm so sorry. The bank flagged some unusual activity on the joint accounts yesterday, some out-of-state queries we didn't recognize. With the merger audit happening, the security team had to place a temporary administrative freeze on all the cards to protect the estate. We just want to make sure the funds are secure." Nathan looked at the floor, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his tablet. "I need my medication, Richard," I said. My voice was very quiet, very flat. "Of course you do," Richard said, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out his leather wallet. He slid a crisp $100 bill across the quartz countertop, placing it beside my cold cup of tea. "Here, use cash for today. If you need anything else, just let me or Nathan know. We'll make sure it's taken care of. We just have to keep the accounts clean until the audit is finalized on Monday." He was treating me like a child receiving an allowance. He was giving me $100 of the money my patents had earned, expecting me to thank him for his charity. I looked at the bill on the counter. I didn't touch it. "Thanks, Mom," Nathan murmured, his voice tight, as if trying to force a resolution to a conflict he was too cowardly to name. We have to be really careful right now. The European lawyers are looking at every transaction." "I understand, Nathan," I said, looking directly into my son's eyes. "I understand exactly what you are doing." Nathan's eyes flickered with a sudden, sharp guilt, and he looked away, pretending to study his screen. I went upstairs to my room and locked the door. I sat at the small writing desk by the window and pulled out my personal cell phone, a prepaid device I had purchased in cash 6 months ago, one that Richard's corporate IT department had no access to. I dialed the number for the Merchants and Farmers Bank, a small, single-branch bank in my hometown, 60 miles away. It was the bank where my parents had kept their savings, a place that still used physical ledger books alongside their computer systems. "Merchants and Farmers, this is Thomas." A friendly, mature voice answered. "Thomas, this is Meredith Vance," I said. "Account ending in 4022. "Ah, Mrs. Vance, good afternoon," the manager said, his tone instantly warm. "It's been a while since we've heard from you. How are things up at the lake?" "They are quiet, Thomas," I said. "I wanted to confirm the status of my savings account." "Let me pull that up for you. Yes, here it is. The balance is $47,312, completely active. But actually, Mrs. Vance, I'm glad you called. We had an inquiry on this account yesterday afternoon." My hand tightened on the phone. "An inquiry?" "Yes. A young man calling from the Vance Polymer corporate offices claimed to have power of attorney over your financial assets due to a medical transition. He wanted to wire the balance to a central corporate account. Did you let him? I asked, my breath caught in my throat. Of course not, Thomas said, sounding slightly offended on my behalf. We are a conservative bank, Mrs. Vance. We require either the original physical passbook or the correct answer to your custom security question for any phone transfers over $10,000. The young man tried to answer the security question 3 times and failed. I let out a slow, silent breath. What was the security question, Thomas? The name of your first laboratory supervisor at the university, Thomas said. He kept guessing Richard Vance. I told him that was incorrect and locked the phone access. I closed my eyes. The supervisor's name was Dr. Robert Chen, the man who had first taught me how to isolate polymer chains in 1990. Richard had never met him. He had forgotten he even existed. Thank you, Thomas, I said. I will be at your branch on Monday morning at 9 o'clock to withdraw the balance in a cashier's check. We'll have it ready for you, Mrs. Vance. I hung up the phone. I looked out the window at the lake, where the gray mist was beginning to dissolve under the cold afternoon sun. Richard thought he had starved me of oxygen. He thought he had left me with nothing but a $100 bill on a kitchen counter. But on Monday morning, while he was waiting for me at the neurologist's office, I would be 60 miles away, holding the funds that would dismantle his empire. I went back to the pharmacy. I paid Clara with the $100 bill Richard had left on the counter, took my amber bottle of thyroid medication, and drove home. My joints were already beginning to feel heavy, a dull ache settling into my lower back, the first warnings of my body slowing down. I swallowed the small white tablet in the car, waiting for the synthetic hormone to find my bloodstream, and drove back to the lake. When I pulled into the driveway, Julianne's sleek white SUV was parked near the front steps, its engine still ticking as it cooled in the autumn air. I walked into the house through the side door. The kitchen was quiet, but as I approached the dining room, I heard the light, musical clink of porcelain and the low, hurried murmur of 2 voices. Julianne stood near the mahogany sideboard, a leather-bound notebook in her hand. Beside her was Chloe, who was carefully wrapping my mother's crystal wine glasses in sheets of white packing paper, placing them into a cardboard box. I stopped in the doorway. Chloe saw me first. She froze, a half-wrapped glass in her hand, her face instantly flushing a deep, guilty red. "Mom," she stammered, looking quickly at Julianne before looking down at the box. We were just organizing." Julianne turned. Her expression was a masterpiece of professional warmth and soft, clinical sympathy. She set her notebook down and walked toward me, her hands open. "Meredith, I'm so glad you're home," Julianne said, her voice dropping into that quiet, soothing register they had all adopted. "We're just helping Richard clear some of the older inventory. He mentioned the appraisers are coming next week to value the estate's physical assets for the merger restructuring." "I see," I said, my voice flat, my hands resting in the pockets of my coat. "We wanted to make sure we didn't touch anything you wanted to keep for yourself," Julianne continued, her smile gentle and patient. "Richard said you'd probably prefer something smaller, more manageable, once the transition is complete. He was looking at those lovely independent living cottages in the foothills. So quiet, so peaceful. We want to make sure your move is as comfortable as possible." Independent living cottages. They had already selected my exile. They were packing my mother's crystal while discussing my placement in a facility, acting as if they were doing me a profound kindness by allowing me to choose which plates to take to my room. Chloe picked up the silver-plated tea tray from the sideboard, the one I had polished just days ago, the wedding gift from my mother. "Julianne, Chloe said, her voice slightly strained as she avoided looking at me. This tray would look amazing in the city penthouse, wouldn't it? Or we could use it for the gallery openings. It's so elegant. She was offering her grandmother's wedding silver to her father's mistress, right in front of the mother who had polished it for 30 years. Chloe looked at me then, her eyes hard, filled with a defensive, ugly defiance. Mom doesn't even use it anymore, she said to Julianne, though she was looking at me. It just sits in the dark cupboard. It's a waste. Psychological insight. People do not steal your life because they hate you. They steal it because they believe they can make better use of it than you can. In Chloe's mind, my silence meant I was already gone, and my possessions were simply resources waiting to be redistributed to those who were still vital. You may have it, Chloe, I said softly. Chloe blinked, surprised by the lack of resistance, a flash of shame crossing her features before she masked it with a tight, cold nod. Thanks, Mom. I'll be in the study, I said, turning away from the dining room. The study was empty. Julianne's designer leather briefcase sat on the corner of Richard's desk, alongside a stack of bound corporate documents. She had likely been working there while Richard was in the city. I stood by the desk. My heart was beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. I listened for the sounds from the dining room, the rustle of paper, the quiet murmur of their voices. They were distracted, discussing whether the china was worth appending to the estate audit. I walked to the desk, my movements silent, practiced over decades of managing this house. I opened the top folder in Julianne's stack. The label read, Vance Eurochem Merger, IP Annex B, Confidential. I flipped through the pages, my eyes scanning the dense legal text until I found what I was looking for. Section 9.2, Representations and Warranties. My breath caught. The acquiring entity, Eurochem AG, reserves the right to immediately terminate the transaction and demand liquidated damages of $12 million from the personal assets of the CEO in the event of any active ownership dispute, cloud on title, or reversionary claim regarding the foundational patents listed in Schedule A, US 5404-94. I read the words twice to ensure my tired eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The merger wasn't just contingent on the patent. Richard had personally guaranteed the title of the patent. If I contested the ownership, if the reversion clause activated on Monday, the merger would fail immediately, and Richard would be personally liable for $12 million to the European partners. It would not just stop the merger, it would ruin him. It would strip him of his city penthouse, his corporate shares, and the very wealth that Julianne and my children were currently wrapping in packing paper. I pulled out my prepaid cell phone, set the camera to silent, and took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of the page. I closed the folder, placing it exactly as it had been, and stepped back from the desk just as I heard the light tap of Julianne's heels returning down the hallway. Julianne walked into the study, carrying a roll of bubble wrap. She stopped when she saw me, her eyes flitting to her briefcase on the corner of the desk before settling on me with that practiced, clinical softness. I was sitting in the small armchair by the window, an old, leather-bound volume of organic chemistry resting in my lap. I had moved so quietly she hadn't heard me. "Oh, Meredith," she said, her voice instantly adjusting to its gentle, patronizing frequency. "I didn't realize you were in here. It's such a peaceful room, isn't it? So much history." "It is," I said, turning a page of the book. She walked to the desk, her fingers tracing the edge of her leather briefcase. She didn't open it. She simply patted the leather, as if confirming its contents, and then looked back at me with a look of profound, elegant pity. "Richard and I were talking," she said, leaning against the edge of the mahogany desk. We really want to make sure you're taken care of, Meredith. The place we found in the foothills, the Oaks, it's truly beautiful. They have a wonderful, highly specialized staff for cognitive support. You'll have your own garden plot. Richard has already agreed to fund it. Cognitive support. She was already using the terminology of my confinement. She stood in my study, holding my husband's desk, telling me where I would spend the rest of my life as if she were offering me a luxury vacation. "That is very thoughtful of you, Julianne," I said. My voice was very soft, very cooperative. Julianne smiled, her shoulders relaxing. She believed she had won. She believed the quiet, tired woman in the gray dress was simply going to slide into the dark without a whisper, grateful for the garden plot they had graciously allocated to her. "We just want what's best for you, dear," she said, picking up her bubble wrap and walking back toward the dining room. On Saturday night, I packed my bag. I didn't use the expensive designer luggage Richard had bought me for our anniversaries. I used an old, battered brown leather suitcase, the one my father had given me when I left for university in 1988. It was scratched, the brass buckles slightly tarnished, but the leather was thick and smelled of cedar. I did not pack the jewelry. I left the diamond tennis bracelets, the emerald pendant, and the gold watch Richard had given me to mark the company's public offering. They had been bought with corporate funds. They belonged to his world. Instead, I packed my raw data. I packed my handwritten research journals from 1991 to 1995. I packed my original laboratory slides, preserved in their plastic cases. And I packed a single photograph, not of our wedding and not of the corporate galas, but a small Polaroid photo of Nathan and Chloe when they were toddlers, playing in the dirt behind our first cramped apartment. They had been real then, before the money had turned them into consumers, before they had learned to trade their mother's life for a gallery sponsorship and a vice president's title. I closed the suitcase, buckled the straps, and slid it under the bed in the guest room. On Sunday morning, the family gathered for brunch. It was a tradition Richard had insisted on maintaining, even as our marriage fell apart. A weekly performance of domestic harmony that we staged for the housekeeper and ourselves. But today, the performance had a new director. When I walked into the dining room, Julianne was already seated. She was sitting at the foot of the table, in the high-backed, upholstered chair that had been mine for 24 years. Richard sat at the head, his laptop open beside his plate. Nathan and Chloe sat on either side, their faces illuminated by the bright morning sun streaming through the French doors. No one stood when I entered. "Meredith, grab a plate," Richard said, not looking up from his screen. "We're just going over the timeline for tomorrow morning. Sit there next to Chloe." He pointed to a small wooden chair that had been pulled from the hallway, a chair meant for guests, not for the mistress of the house. I sat. I did not say a word about the seat. I did not protest the restructuring of my own table. Psychological insight. Betrayal is never a single dramatic blow. It is a series of polite relocations. They move you from your seat, then from your room, then from your life, all while asking if you need more water, until you begin to believe you were never actually there to begin with. "So, the meeting with Dr. Sterling is at 10, Nathan was saying, his fork hovering over his plate. "The legal team wants to make sure we have the preliminary clearance before the board meeting at 2. It makes the transition look much cleaner to the European auditors." "Exactly," Richard said, finally closing his laptop and looking at me. "Meredith, before we leave for the clinic tomorrow, there's one more document the legal team needs you to sign. It's just a standard medical disclosure waiver." He slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. It stopped beside my plate, next to the silver tea tray Chloe had packed the day before. I looked at the document. It was an authorization form allowing Dr. Lawrence Sterling of the Lakeside Neurological Group to share his clinical findings directly with the Vance Polymer Compliance Committee. If I signed this, Dr. Sterling's diagnosis, the one Richard had undoubtedly already secured, would be sent directly to the board, giving them the legal authority to execute the emergency power of attorney and strip me of my patent rights before the reversion window closed at midnight. "It's just to expedite the audit, Mom," Chloe said, her voice thin, her eyes focused intently on her fruit bowl. "So everything is in one place." They were all watching me. Richard's face was a mask of cold, demanding expectation. Nathan's jaw was tight. Chloe was holding her breath. They had surrounded me, using my own dining room as a boardroom, waiting to see if the quiet woman would finally break. "I will take it with the other folder, Richard," I said, my voice calm, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the paper. "I'll have them both ready for you in the morning." Richard's eyes narrowed, a flash of impatience crossing his features. "Meredith, the meeting is at 10. I expect the signed papers on my desk by 8 o'clock sharp. We don't have time for delays." "They will be ready, Richard," I said. I picked up the paper, stood up from the guest chair, and walked out of the room, leaving my family to finish their brunch in the house I had built. At 11:30 on Sunday night, my bedroom door opened. I hadn't turned on the lights. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the moonlight trace the silver outlines of the pine trees near the lake. Richard stood in the doorway, his silhouette tall and imposing against the warm light of the hallway. He had taken off his jacket, his collar unbuttoned, looking like a man who had spent the evening celebrating a victory that hadn't yet been declared. He didn't step into the room. He simply leaned against the frame, his voice carrying a cold, quiet arrogance that had stripped away the last of his performative concern. "Meredith," he said, his tone dry, "I just want to make sure we're clear about tomorrow. I don't want any scenes at Dr. Sterling's office. You're going to walk in, you're going to let him do the evaluation, and you're going to sign the disclosure waiver." "I told you the papers would be ready, Richard," I said softly, my eyes remaining on the dark water outside. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. "You've always been so stubborn, Meredith, but you need to understand something. Vance Polymer is my name. It's my face on the brochures. The research you did in that basement 30 years ago, it was just a starting point. I built the empire. I did the travel. I made the pitches. I took the risks. You're a footnote, honey. The sooner you accept that, the easier this transition will be for you." He genuinely believed it. He had repeated the story of his self-made success to reporters, investors, and our children for so long that he had successfully erased me from his own memory. To him, my 30 years of sacrifice weren't a partnership. They were an administrative detail he had finally outgrown. "Go to sleep," he said, pulling the door shut. "I'll see you at 8. I sat in the dark for a long time after his footsteps faded. Psychological insight. Arrogance is the fatal vulnerability of those who take power too easily. Because they did not build the foundation themselves, they forget that the person who laid the bricks knows exactly which pillar to pull to bring the entire roof down. At 3:15 on Monday morning, I stood up. The house was dead silent, wrapped in the thick, freezing fog that rolled off the lake before dawn. I picked up my father's old leather suitcase from under the bed. I didn't turn on a single light. I navigated the stairs by memory, my soft, rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the oak treads. I paused in the foyer. The silver-plated tea tray was gone, already packed into one of the boxes Chloe and Julianne had taped shut. The house felt hollow, like an exhibition of a life that had already ended. I felt no sadness, no regret. I felt only a profound, clean emptiness. I walked out the side door, locking it quietly behind me. I did not take the luxury SUV Richard had leased for me, the one with the integrated GPS and corporate cellular tracking. Instead, I got into my old 12-year-old sedan, a car I had refused to trade in because the engine was simple and it had no computer screen on the dashboard. I started the engine. It idled with a quiet, reliable hum. I put it in gear and drove down the winding driveway, leaving the lake and the empty estate behind in the dark fog. At 9 o'clock sharp, I parked outside the Merchants and Farmers Bank in my hometown. The morning sun was weak, barely cutting through the mist as the bank's security guard unlocked the heavy glass doors. I walked inside. The lobby was warm, smelling of fresh coffee and old carpet. Thomas, the branch manager, was waiting for me. He escorted me to his private office, where a single, neat document sat on his desk. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice respectful and calm. "We have the cashier's check ready for you, as requested. $47,312. "Thank you, Thomas," I said, signing the withdrawal ledger. "And we've prepared the $3,000 in cash as well," he added, handing me a small, thick envelope alongside the cashier's check. "Are you going to be all right, Meredith? If you need anything else, our family has known yours for a long time." "I'm going to be fine, Thomas. More than fine," I said, taking the envelope. I walked out of the bank at 9:15. Arthur Pendleton was waiting for me in his old, dark blue Buick in the far corner of the parking lot. I walked over, opened the passenger door, and sat inside. The interior smelled of old paper and peppermint. I handed him the cashier's check. Arthur adjusted his spectacles, looking at the check before sliding it into his leather portfolio. "This will cover the federal filing fees and the forensic retainer for Dr. Ross. The shield is fully funded, Meredith." He turned to look at me, his thick white eyebrows knitting together with a quiet, fierce intensity. "We filed the formal declaration of capacity and the patent ownership contest with the Federal Registry at exactly 8:01 this morning. By law, the second that file was registered, a litigation hold was placed on Vance Polymer US 540494. My heart gave a single, hard thud. "What does that mean for the merger?" "It means the merger is frozen," Arthur said. "The European legal team will receive the automated title cloud alert within the hour. By 10 o'clock, their compliance officer will be calling Richard's office to demand an explanation." As if on cue, Arthur's cell phone, sitting on the dashboard between us, began to vibrate. The caller ID screen flashed with a name in bold black letters, Richard Vance. It was 9:20. Richard had realized I was not at the house, and he had not received his signed papers at 8. Arthur looked at the vibrating phone, then at me. His face was calm, his eyes steady behind his spectacles. "It begins," he said quietly. Arthur pressed the speakerphone button on his dashboard. The silence in the Buick was instantly shattered by the sharp, metallic distortion of Richard's voice. He wasn't yelling. Richard rarely yelled, but his tone had the vibrating, razor-thin edge of a man who was watching his authorities slip away in real time. "Arthur, what the hell is this filing?" Richard demanded, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts. "My corporate counsel just got an automated notification from the Federal Patent Office. A litigation hold on the 94 polymer? Who authorized this?" Arthur adjusted his spectacles, his voice remaining as dry and steady as a textbook. "Meredith authorized it, Richard. As the sole primary inventor, she has filed a formal declaration of capacity and contested your emergency power of attorney." "This is absurd," Richard snapped. "Meredith is confused, Arthur. She's been having episodes for months.
We have an appointment with Dr. Sterling at 10 o'clock to address this. Where is she? Let me speak to her. Meredith is with me, Richard, Arthur said, looking straight through his windshield at the gray mist. And she will not be attending the appointment with Dr. Sterling. We have already filed a certified independent forensic evaluation from Dr. Miriam Ross, confirming her perfect cognitive capacity. Your capacity filing is null and void. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched over the speaker. I could hear the distant murmur of traffic on Richard's end, the soft hum of his office air conditioning. He had spent months constructing a clinical trap, believing I was too slow, too isolated, and too tired to notice. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a dark, low hiss. You're ruining her, Arthur. You're ruining this family.
If this merger falls through because of some bitter emotional stunt, she won't have a cent of alimony to pay your retainer. I will tie her up in court until she's broke. We are comfortable with our position, Richard, Arthur said quietly. Good day. He tapped the screen, ending the call. The silence returned to the Buick, heavy and still. I looked down at my hands. They weren't shaking. By noon, I had checked into the Blue Spruce Inn, a modest 2-story motel on the state highway, 30 miles from the lake. The room smelled of clean cotton sheets and pine disinfectant. It had a small oak desk, a television from the previous decade, and a window that faced a quiet patch of woods. It was sterile, simple, and completely disconnected from the life I had lived for 30 years. I unbuckled my father's leather suitcase and placed my research journals on the desk. For 3 decades, my days had been dictated by an invisible, relentless clock. I woke at 5 to prepare Richard's breakfast. I managed the housekeeper's schedule. I coordinated the dry cleaning, the grocery deliveries, the maintenance for the lakeside estate. I spent my afternoons listening to Chloe's gallery anxieties and my evenings tracking Nathan's corporate advancements. I had been the emotional oil in their machine, ensuring the gears turned without friction, never asking why my own hands were constantly black with grease. Now, there was nothing. No schedule, no demands, no one asking me where their keys were or what we were having for dinner, or if I could sign a corporate release before the auditors arrived. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the cold autumn rain begin to tap against the glass. Psychological insight. My absence was the loudest thing I had ever produced. They had spent decades treating my presence as background noise, but the second I stepped out of the machine, the gears immediately began to grind against each other. At 3 o'clock, I turned on my old cell phone, the one Richard's company paid for. I had kept it silent in my handbag, but the moment the screen illuminated, it began to vibrate continuously, a barrage of missed calls and voicemails flooding the screen. None of them were from Richard. He was too proud, or perhaps too busy with his lawyers, to call me directly. The messages were from our children. I pressed the speaker button on the first voicemail from Nathan, recorded at 9:45 that morning. "Mom, where are you?" His voice was hurried, his corporate composure cracking. "Dad is calling an emergency board meeting. Why did your lawyer file that patent hold? You need to call me right now, Mom. This is putting the entire Q4 projection at risk. The European compliance team is already asking questions." The next message was from 11:15. Nathan's tone had shifted from demanding to a raw, breathless panic. "Mom, please, the European partners just suspended the pre-merger audits. They're pausing the transaction. He's completely beside himself. He's saying if the title cloud isn't cleared by Friday, they might invoke the pre-merger liability clause. Mom, do you know what that means? It means they can go after his personal assets. The house, Mom. They can freeze the estate. Call me." The third message was from Chloe, recorded at 12:30. Her voice was shaking, wet with tears. "Mom, what did you do? Julianne's marketing team just had their funding suspended. Dad is locked in his study, and Nathan is shouting at the corporate lawyers in the kitchen. Julianne is pack hunting for her files. She says someone moved her corporate folders yesterday, and she's screaming at Dad because she thinks you were in the study. You're destroying everything, Mom. Why are you doing this to us? What did we ever do to you?" I listened to the messages in the quiet motel room. Not once did either of my children ask where I was. Not once did they ask if I was safe, or why I had left, or how I had felt when they wrapped my mother's silver tea tray in packing paper. Their panic was entirely transactional. They were not mourning the loss of their mother. They were mourning the sudden, terrifying instability of their funding. I turned the phone off, slid it back into my handbag, and looked out at the rain. The storm was raging 30 miles away, but in this room, the air was perfectly, beautifully still. On Monday evening, my prepaid phone rang. The screen displayed a local number I had programmed years ago. I slid the bar to answer. "Mrs. Vance?" The voice was trembling, tight with a high, thin anxiety. It was Elsie, our housekeeper of 15 years. She was a quiet, practical woman from the nearby valley, someone who usually moved through our home like a silent shadow, keeping the cedar floors polished and the pantry stocked without ever raising her voice. "Yes, Elsie, I'm here," I said, leaning against the headboard of the motel bed. "Oh, thank goodness," Elsie whispered, her breath hitching. "Mrs. Vance, I didn't know who else to call. The house is in a terrible state. Mr. Vance and Miss Mercer had an awful row last night in the dining room. I've never heard him speak like that. She packed her bags and drove back to the city in the middle of the night. And today, Mr. Vance won't leave the study. He's locked himself in and he won't eat. Chloe has been crying in her room all afternoon." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "Nathan keep asking me where you keep the old corporate tax ledgers and the keys to the filing cabinets in the basement. But I don't know, Mrs. Vance. Everything is falling apart. No one has fed the dogs, and the kitchen it's a disaster." I listened to her recount the collapse of my former world. For 30 years, I had been the invisible glue holding those walls together. I was the one who remembered where every key was kept, who managed the accounts, who ensured the domestic machinery ran so smoothly that Richard and my children could believe their lives were naturally orderly. "Elsie," I said, my voice soft and entirely calm. "You've worked very hard for our family, and I am grateful for everything you've done. But I want you to pack your things, lock the back door, and go home to your family." "But, Mrs. Vance, the house—" "Leave it, Elsie," I said. "Take the next 2 weeks off. I will wire your full salary to your personal account tonight. Do not go back there until I call you." A long pause stretched over the line, followed by a soft, hesitant sigh of relief. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance. I think I'll do that." I hung up. I transferred the funds to Elsie's account using my banking app. I was systematically withdrawing the emotional and physical labor that had sustained them. I was letting the dust settle on the mahogany, letting the pantry empty, letting the dark close in on the study. I wanted them to experience the true weight of the silence they had taken for granted. The next morning, I met Arthur Pendleton at a quiet, wood-paneled diner on the highway. The diner smelled of maple syrup and burnt coffee. Arthur sat in a booth near the back, his leather portfolio open, a yellow legal pad covered in his meticulous, sweeping handwriting. "Richard's corporate counsel is in a state of panic, Meredith," Arthur said, taking a sip of his black tea. "They've threatened to file a civil injunction against you. They're claiming corporate espionage,
asserting that you accessed and photographed proprietary merger documents from Julianne's files.
I set my teacup down. Let them file it, Arthur. Arthur smiled, a dry, satisfied curl of his thin lips.
Exactly. If they file that motion, the photos of Julianne's folders become part of the public court record.
The European partners and the SEC will see that Richard was actively trying to certify an unencumbered patent title while knowing there was an active ownership dispute. It's fraud, Meredith. If they push this, Richard faces personal criminal liability, and the Eurochem deal is dead forever. He knows that, I said.
His lawyers do, Arthur corrected.
Which is why they won't file the injunction. They are playing checkers, Meredith. You are playing chemistry. They don't understand that every reaction has an inevitable, equal counter-reaction. When I returned to the Blue Spruce Inn at noon, Nathan's luxury sedan was parked in the gravel lot. He was leaning against the hood, his expensive wool coat unbuttoned, his silk tie crooked. His hair was uncombed, and his leather shoes were covered in a layer of gray gravel dust. He looked exhausted, the sharp, confident veneer of the young vice president completely shattered. When he saw my sedan, he stood up quickly and ran toward me as I parked. "Mom," he gasped, grabbing the edge of my driver's side window as I rolled it down. "Thank God. I've been driving to every motel within 40 miles of the bank. I knew you'd stay somewhere quiet." I opened the door and stepped out. He tried to reach forward to hug me, but I stood perfectly still, my arms at my sides. He pulled back, his eyes wide, filled with a raw, desperate frustration. "Mom, you have to stop this," he pleaded, his hands shaking. "The board called an emergency closed-door session this morning. They're talking about removing Dad as CEO to protect the company's stock price. If he gets ousted, I'm done, Mom. My position, my career, everything I built at Vance Polymer is tied to his leadership. You're destroying my future." I looked at my son. He was 28, but in that moment, he looked like a terrified child who had just realized the floor beneath him wasn't solid. "Nathan," I said quietly, "did you think about my future when you drafted the waiver that called my 30 years of research an incidental domestic contribution?" He flinched, his face going pale. That was business, Mom. The underwriters required clean corporate IP. We didn't have a choice. It wasn't personal." "Then this is business too, Nathan," I said, my voice as calm as the autumn air. "It isn't personal." "But Julianne is leaving him, Mom," Nathan burst out, his voice cracking, losing its corporate polish entirely. "She packed her things on Sunday night. She told Dad she didn't sign up to be married to a bankrupt pariah. She's taking her branding team and the European VC contacts she brought to the table. He's completely destroyed. He's just sitting in the study in the dark." Psychological insight. He had built his empire on my silence, and his new romance on his wealth. Without my emotional labor to support his home, and without his money to purchase his mistress's devotion, he was simply an old man sitting alone in a dark room. "I know," I said. "How can you be so cold?" Nathan whispered, his eyes wet with a selfish, desperate anger. "We're your family." "You were," I said softly, turning my back on him and walking toward my motel room door, leaving my son alone in the gravel parking lot. On Friday morning, the glass-walled boardroom of Vance Polymer Solutions was silent. The room sat on the 20th floor of the city's financial tower, overlooking the gray harbor. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table. He had lost weight,
His bespoke suit looked slightly too large at the shoulders, and his silver hair was uncharacteristically dull. Beside him sat Nathan, staring blankly at his tablet, and in the corner, Chloe clutched her designer handbag as if it were a shield against the quiet of the room. They had assembled their corporate attorneys. They were waiting for me.
Richard had a blue folder in front of him, undoubtedly a generous marital settlement drafted to make me go away before the Eurochem delegation officially walked away from the table. The double doors opened. I walked in. I was not wearing the designer clothes Richard had purchased for me to wear to his galas. I wore a simple charcoal wool suit, the one I had bought myself in 1989 when I defended my master's thesis. Behind me walked Arthur Pendleton, carrying his old leather portfolio, and beside him was a tall, elegant man with iron gray hair and a sharp, tailored suit. Richard stood up, his face instantly tightening into a look of desperate, manipulative relief.
Meredith, thank God. Let's sit down and resolve this. Arthur, we can skip the posturing. We have a very substantial settlement package ready.
Arthur did not sit. He did not open the settlement folder. Instead, he introduced the man beside him.
Richard, this is Dr. Klaus Weber, Arthur said, his voice dry and perfectly measured. He is the Chief Acquisition Officer for Eurochem AG. He flew in from Munich last night.
Richard's breath hitched, his eyes flitting from Dr. Weber to me, a sudden dark dread pooling in his gaze.
Klaus, I don't understand. Our meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock at the hotel.
Dr. Weber did not smile. He adjusted his gold spectacles and looked at Richard with the cold, clinical detachment of a European banker.
Mr. Vance, as of 8 o'clock this morning, Eurochem AG has officially terminated all merger negotiations with Vance Polymer Solutions under Clause 9.2 of our preliminary agreement.
Klaus, wait! Richard stammered, his hand reaching out as if to physically hold the deal in the air.
The patent title. It's just a temporary domestic dispute. My legal team is clearing the title cloud today. We can proceed with the audit. The patent title is already clear, Mr. Vance. Dr. Weber interrupted smoothly. But it is not owned by your corporation.
Yesterday evening, Eurochem AG executed a direct, exclusive 20-year licensing agreement for the polymer formula US 540494 with the primary inventor and sole legal owner, Mrs. Meredith Vance. The boardroom went completely, utterly cold. Nathan's tablet slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. Chloe let out a small, high-pitched gasp, her eyes wide with a blank, terrified incomprehension.
Meredith, Richard whispered, his face turning the color of wet ash. What did you do?
Under Clause 9.2, Arthur Pendleton continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. Your false certification of an unencumbered patent title has triggered the personal liability clause of the preliminary contract. You are personally liable to Eurochem AG for $12 million in liquidated damages. Dr. Weber's legal team filed the asset attachment order at 9 o'clock this morning. Richard sank back into his high-backed leather chair. He looked small. He looked like an old man who had suddenly run out of breath.
I don't have $12 million in personal liquidity, he murmured. The estate, the house, the corporate shares.
We know, Arthur said, which is why, to satisfy the debt and avoid a public bankruptcy filing that would destroy the remaining value of the company, you have signed the transfer documents we delivered to your counsel this morning. You have transferred 42% of your personal corporate stock in Vance Polymer to the patent holder." Richard stared at me. The silence of the room was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the ventilation. "You," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and terror. "You took my shares." "I didn't take them, Richard," I said softly, looking at my husband for the first time. "You spent 30 years spending my labor. I simply collected the debt." Nathan stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. "Mom, what about me? I'm the vice president of operations. The merger, my position—" I looked at my son. His suit was expensive, but he had never learned how to run the machines in the basement. He had only learned how to read the spreadsheets I had made possible. "Vance Polymer is being restructured under the Eurochem partnership, Nathan," I said, my voice gentle and entirely devoid of anger. "We are modernizing our executive committee. Your department's compliance records during the patent transition were unsatisfactory. Your termination letter was signed this morning." Nathan looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. He slowly sat back down, his shoulders slumping as he stared at the empty space on the table. Chloe looked up, tears streaming down her face, her voice wet and desperate. "Mom, please. My gallery. The spring exhibition. You can't do this to me. I'm your daughter." "The gallery sponsorship was a corporate write-off, Chloe," I said. "The new board has decided to reallocate those funds to the university's biochemistry department to fund research grants for young women. You will have to find an independent patron." She wept quietly into her hands, but I felt nothing. The emotional reserve I had kept for them had been entirely depleted, poured into a vessel that had never learned to hold water. An hour later, the boardroom was empty. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the cold, gray harbor. The mist was finally clearing, the sun cutting through the clouds to turn the water into a sheet of brilliant, polished silver. On the mahogany table behind me sat my mother's silver-plated tea tray. I had Arthur recover it as part of the physical asset division. It was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the clean white light of the sky. I picked up my father's old blue ink fountain pen. I opened the newly minted corporate ledger of Vance Eurochem Holdings, and on the first line of the new registry, I signed my name, Meredith A. Vance, chairperson. They had spent 30 years waiting for me to disappear, never realizing that I was simply waiting for the noise to stop.